Now, when our app connects to Facebook for the login, it needs to store the Facebook user profile in a database. That's why we created the MongoLab account earlier. To interact with the MongoLab account, what we require is MongooseJS. Mongoose, as the description says here, provides a straightforward schema-based solution to modeling your application data. And it's really very easy to use. Some of the big companies that use Mongoose in production include McDonald's and Storify. Alright, so once you have Mongoose installed, the next thing to do is to call Mongoose inside the app. So we'll create a variable called Mongoose and we'll set it to require mongoose.connect, and we will pass in the config.db URL. So we had earlier stored the MongoLab URL inside our development.json and production.json. So that's what we are going to directly call. The .connect allows Mongoose to directly connect to the MongoLab account so that we can use this connection in our app. Now let's just try this out and see if this works. So I'm going to log into my MongoLab account at the same time. So let's go to mongolab.com. And let's go into the ChatCat database. Alright, so what I'm going to do is create some sample code which will store some data in the database, and we will do this just to check whether the connection is working fine or not. So when you have to use Mongoose, what you have to do first is you have to define a schema. A schema basically represents or defines the structure within which you want to store your data. So for instance, if it is a user schema, then you'll create a variable called user schema and you'll set this to mongoose.schema, wherein we will create 3 fields, the first being username, and the username is of the type string, followed by a password, which let's say in our case is also a string, and then let's say we have the full name of the individual, which again would be a string. So once we define the schema, the next thing to do is to turn the schema into a model, and the model is what we will use to interact with the database. Also, the model represents the collection which will be created at the MongoLab account. So we'll create a variable called person and we'll set this to mongoose.model. You create a name for your collection. So in this case, the collection will be called users and the schema would be the user schema. Alright, so once you have this, then to actually create a record, to actually store a record, just create a variable called John, and which will be instantiated with a new person, and within the bracket we'll just create our value. So username is, for example, John Doe. The password, something as simple as John wants to log in, followed by the full name, which will be again John Doe, right? So once you have created a variable which represents an instance of the Mongoose model that you've created and you have your data in there, all you need to do is you need to call the .save method, which will actually save the data into the database. So up till this point, no interaction takes place with the database. So what you need to do is you need to say john.save, and inside the function you can just return the error, and we'll just say console.log done. Right, so let's run the app and see if we are able to get this data inside our MongoLab account. So go back to the console, node app.js, and it says done. Okay, so the moment you get done, let's go here, and you can see that we have a users collection. So let's go into the users collection, and you can see that we have our record here with the username John Doe, password John wants to log in, and the full name John Doe. So this way you can use Mongoose to store data inside our MongoLab account. Now, in the production specific settings that we created earlier for storing the session in a production environment, we were using the Connect Mongo interface. Now, the Connect Mongo was provided with a URL to the MongoLab account. Now, in this case, what happens is Mongoose creates its own connection and the Connect Mongo creates its own connection. So to avoid this, what we can do is we can disable this parameter, and instead we will call mongoose underscore connection, and we will set this to mongoose, which is the variable that we have instantiated for the mongoose module, followed by dot connections, and dot connections refers to an array, and we just require the first instance of the array. The first instance would have the active connection that we have instantiated already. So this way the Connect Mongo will use the same connection which we have already established in the app, and that way you won't have multiple connections going to the same MongoLab account, right? So this is how you set up Mongoose. What we are going to do is we're going to delete this code because this code is not required in our app, but you can always create this just for testing purposes.